What I'm going to do is basically go to each of the speakers and ask you for your key introductions. And then I'll pose you one follow-up question to go into more details with the area of expertise that you belong to. And I think I'll start with the Bahar Saab from the Ministry of Climate. Sid, maybe Bahar Saab, if you can share about your reflections on the discussion that we had and the key findings that we discussed with the report, and then we move to each of the speakers. We will have 5 minutes for you.
First of all, I am highly grateful to the Transparency International, particularly Kashif Saab, who has provided Government of Sindh an opportunity to attend this dissemination event. Let me introduce myself. I am basically an agricultural engineer. I am not the person of finance. I am having the experience related to environment and somehow the climate change. And I am working as a director, technical headquarters. My introduction was not correct, which that's why I am trying to introduce myself first. No doubt this report on climate finance is a comprehensive and it gives us the roadmap which aligns the climate finance and climate finance related issues. But there are some issues which I think may be addressed further, like I was discussing earlier. Data collection and monitoring mechanism should also be addressed properly, because without monitoring, we are not able to have a proper decision. There was one study related to the climate expenditures, as one of the speakers has told that there should be some budgetary allocation should be enhanced by the provinces. But before that, we need to have the study which addresses the climate expenditures which are being incurred and which have been incurred. I think it was done about 9-10 years back, 2016 or 2015. That was done by the Dr. Kamal Zama. In fact, Government of Sindh, I know about the Government of Sindh, as some of the projects have already been pointed out by one of the respectable speaker, that 5 to 6 projects have already been taken by the Government of Sindh, and one project is Delta Blue Carbon 1, that is now Delta Blue Carbon 2 is also there. But there are several other projects, they may not be related to the mitigation, but mostly they are related to the adaptation actions by different departments, like agriculture, like livestock, like fisheries. I can give you an example. For instance, in agriculture, there are certain projects which are addressing heat resistance crops, soil tolerant crops. Water conservation techniques are also there in water and in agriculture. But we don't know कि कितना उसमें हमारे expenditures already इनकर हो चुका है, और हम कितने कर रहे हैं, and we are in fact addressing the climate change, whether through adaptation or mitigation. Even in the mitigation, we have certain projects related to the transport department and energy department within Government of Sindh. मगर अभी तक data और monitoring में इसीलिए कह रहा था कि we don't have proper data that how much projects under that NDP's portfolio have been already initiated and are being taken, are in future are to be taken. तो ये चीजें भी हमें पहले चेक करनी चाहिए कि हम फिर no doubt then we need to have capacity building and institutional strengthening in order to have the more access to these finances, whether it's international or national level. That's it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Saab. Next, I think I'll go to GCF. Mr. Albert is joining us online. Albert, before you joined us this morning, we had discussed about how the climate governance and climate finance is important. And I think talking about this in the context of COP28 and the plethora of pledges that were made, and I think for a country like Pakistan, we know how access to climate finance is essential. So I would like to know if you had a look at the report, if you have any initial reflections on the findings, particularly from the point of view of strengthening climate governance frameworks and the role that the GCF is playing in that. Albert is a deputy head of the Independent Integrity Unit at the GCF. So over to you, Mr. Albert.
Sorry, apologies, I was on mute. I was having a little bit of difficulty hearing you. I hope I'm coming loud and clear.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I hear you.
So any initial reflections on the report, or broadly how important you think transparency and effectiveness within the governance frameworks is essential for access to climate finance?
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to kind of be here and speak a little bit about the GCF and also a reflection on your report. It is a detailed document. I believe it's about 50-something some odd pages, so I haven't had an opportunity to digest it completely. However, you did share with me some of the questions that you would like to maybe get our points of view and the GCS kind of feeling on that. And I think if I may speak a little bit is as it pertains to Pakistan, I think countries like Pakistan are really vulnerable to climate impacts and require substantial resources for adaptation and resilience. Now, despite being one of the top countries affected by climate change, Pakistan does not proportionately get the share of global climate financing. But this reflects, I don't think it's a reflection on just Pakistan, I think it's just a reflection on the complex landscape of climate finance. However, in terms of my analysis, and this is somewhat of a rough sketch, Pakistan ranks at about 89th percentile in relation to other entities based on GCF disbursement, with 7 projects totaling about $250 million, approved readiness of about $5.2 million. Now, although there remains a significant room of improvement, this is relatively encouraging because the GCF is currently embarking on improving mechanisms to more expeditiously access climate financing. And I believe this holds true for all the other climate finance institutions. Now, in this response, I would like to touch on a few areas I believe that countries like Pakistan can look to improve and how international organizations can help facilitate the improvement of governance in our respective projects. One of the biggest areas here is, of course, institutional strengthening and capacity building, enhancing the capacities of institutions responsible for managing climate finance is really critical. Strengthening the capacities of key integrity areas, auditing, reporting, entities should ensure that climate finance is managed effectively and transparently. Now, what can we as international organizations do, right? International organizations can provide the technical assistance and capacity building programs. Our general role play a crucial element in facilitating knowledge exchange and with access to global institutions. This kind of can exemplify the strong governance structures. But we at the IAU also doing this. We at the IAU also looking to institute programs to try and make sure that these elements and outreach efforts are successful. We started doing this over the past couple of years, and I'll elaborate on that in a little bit. Now, another area I think that is important is improvement of enhancing transparency and reporting. Adopting a uniform approach to reporting on climate spending, creating open database, open source information ensure that our accredited entities meet the requirements that are necessary to get GCF funding activities, GCF funds. Now, what this does is, of course, strengthen the access to our projects. It allows us to ensure that there are robust monitoring and evaluation mechanisms, and ensure that there is effective monitoring of these of the use of GCF funds. So we also have and ensure that entities have robust integrity and anti-corruption policies. So, my thoughts.
Yes, Debbie, and then maybe I'll come to you regarding the integrity measures for the follow-up question, and maybe for your opening remarks, I'll stop you here and go to the next speakers, and we'll come back to you regarding what are proposed GCFs, anti-corruption integrity measures and the utilization of climate finance in the follow-up question. So maybe, Tobias, if I can come to you. So Tobias is a country economist at the World Bank. You have been leading, the large portfolios of governance and economic reforms. What are your initial, reflections on the discussion that we had?
Thank you. Obviously, a very useful report and a very important contribution to the discussion around the required governance institutional reforms. I wanted to reflect a little bit on perhaps some of the things that are not in the report, but some of the broader context that I think is important for this report. I mean, I think in the report you see this overall narrative in terms of saying if we get the very specific institutions and frameworks around climate change improved, that will mobilize international climate finance that will allow us to address climate challenges. And I wanted to just maybe challenge that softly, because I think while it's very important we do address these climate change institutional problems, I think unless we deal with some of the broader cross-cutting problems currently facing Pakistan, we're going to continue to have challenges. And if you look at the overall financing needs, so the World Bank estimate, I think, is $348 billion over 10 years. It's very unlikely that we are going to be able to access local grant, aid financing, anything like that in Pakistan. So how do you fill this gap? How do you fill this gap? And I think that one area that might be worth thinking about in terms of the broader context of this report is on private financing and what institutional and policy reforms would be required to mobilize increased private financing for adaptation and mitigation. Because I think that really is going to be the future globally for a lot of the adaptation needs. This can't be met by the public sector. The resources simply aren't there. So we need to be thinking about how to mobilize private finance. And I think in Pakistan, obviously part of that is in the space of climate institutions. But I think there's a whole broader agenda to be considered there in terms of the business enabling environment, in terms of the regulatory framework that allows or attracts private investment, the red tape business needs to deal with, the foreign investment regime and the extent to which the policy and regulatory settings are in place to allow foreign investment to occur. Obviously, you have a huge market here. We have 240 million people. You have a fast-growing economy in a very strategic region. There's a lot that would attract investment to Pakistan to take advantage of opportunities to meet climate adaptation and mitigation needs if the regulatory and policy frameworks were in place. I think the second thing to think about there is in terms of the incentives that the government establishes in terms of its fiscal policies, in terms of its tax policies, in terms of its spending policies. How can the government use its tax policy to actually reorient private investment into adaptation and mitigation needs, how can we incentivize firms to reorient their investment towards clean energy, towards low emissions productive processes, towards renewable energy investments. This is I think the real elephant in the room. This is the low hanging fruit, and this really is the only way that Pakistan is going to be able to meet its enormous investment needs, is bringing in the private sector. And I think that is a part of this framework that is it falls beyond what's discussed in this report, but I think in some ways is an enabler for everything that this report is discussing, and it's perhaps even more significant. The only other point I'd like to make as well is that I think a lot of what comes through this report refers to challenges of governance that come from the government fiscal federal structure. We have these real problems of coordination between federal and provincial policy. We have continued lack of clarity in terms of expenditure responsibilities. We have fragmentation of revenue collection between federal and provincial level. It's very hard, and the recommendations, the issues identified in this report, they very much echo the same issues that are found in all kinds of different segments, whether that's human capital, whether that's energy, whether that's infrastructure. Unless we do better in terms of overall coordination between provincial and federal levels, policy coherence, expenditure coherence, we're going to have this kind of problem. I think the other part of the fiscal federalism discussion is the role of local government. So much of what happens in Pakistan hits the ground at the local level. It's about making sure that adaptation needs of communities are met, that mitigation needs at community level can be addressed in some way. But really, I think the focus should be on adaptation. And I think the critical point here is without an effective feedback loop between the local level and where the decisions about policy and expenditure are being made, provincial capitals, the federal capital, without that missing level at the local level, how do you create that accountability? How do you create that accountability loops? How do you make sure that solutions are grounded in local problems, local experience, local knowledge? So again, I think that there's obviously perhaps beyond the scope of this report, but I find it again hard to think about how we solve climate governance and climate finance in Pakistan without a good hard look at some of the broadest challenges we face with the absence of effective local government without fiscal federalism arrangements between provincial and federal government. Let me stop there.
I'll come to Ms. Asha, I'll come to you. You have been one of the prominent voices on climate change. And so Ms. Aisha Khan is the CEO of the Civil Society Coalition on Climate Change. Maybe I'll ask you first what your reflections are. You have written a lot on the climate governance, on climate change in the country. If you can share some initial thoughts.
Thank you, Kashif. Thank you for inviting me. And I also found the report very useful. We didn't have it with us ahead of time, so I couldn't read it thoroughly, but I glanced through it, and then in the presentations, I think the two presenters did a very good job in acquainting us with the high points that were reflected in the report. I think in any report that is brought out at any time, you have to contextualize it in the time that you're living. And for us, I think it's a troubling convergence right now of the climate crisis, of the armed conflict that we're facing in the world, of soaring inflation, and the escalating debt burden. And all of these combined together create a problem which becomes huge for developing countries to cope with when you have added external exogenous factors like climate change, like COVID, which still has a lingering effect on the global economy and the economy of developing countries. So in moving forward, I think in the immediate future, what we're looking at right now are the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, and the ambition to improve upon them for each country, and the pressure for Pakistan also whether it's going to upgrade and present a more ambitious NDC at the upcoming COP or not. The second one, I think, is the emphasis that was put at the last COP on moving away from fossil fuels, which means just equitable to renewable energy. And the third one is in accelerating the need for technology to transition for sequestration, for storage, for carbon capture. So all of these require finance. And when we talk about finance, we understand that in the last 20 years or so, or 28 years of climate negotiations, finance has been a stumbling block. It is always who pays for it and how will it be spent. So I think in terms of what was said by the presenter, that for Pakistan, there are two things that are very important. How much homework has it done on its own, and what are the vulnerabilities and crises for which it is responsible as a country? How much is climate change now adding to these existing vulnerabilities, and what is the climate justice and our demand for access to finance? So whenever we look at finance, we need to look at it through the lens of the people and the policies. And I think in terms of policies, we see the obstacle, we see the glitches that we face. We also know that in international finance right now, our take at these COPs, along with the voices of the other developing countries, is that the international global financial architecture is not fit for purpose. We need to contextualize it in the times that we're living in, and for the current needs of the developing countries to cope with mitigation and adaptation, this financial architecture is not going to be the answer. The other thing we know very clearly is that public finance alone will not provide the answer. We need a very good blend of public and private finance. And we also need to have innovative thinking out of the box on how to use that finance so that access, affordability, and scale can be made available for our people. I think means of implementation becomes a very important tool for us in demand for finance and for improving efficiency, transparency, and accountability. And if we cannot right now get that from the international climate negotiations, at least we should start applying that at our own level in our own climate financing and budgeting and climate coding in, to see how can we track finance and how can we link strengthening capacity, providing technology to the lesser able partners within the country. For example, if Balochistan or Gilgit-Baltistan or some of the other places don't have that capacity, how can then the center provide that capacity, or how can we create the linkages between the more evolved provinces and the less evolved provinces in climate action, climate policy, to work together to share knowledge, information, and strengthen capacity. So again, it comes back to what is it that we can showcase that we can do on our own, and what is it for which we need external support. Another thing, taking a key from what you said as well, which is not part of the report, I think what we need to look at is the other factors that we need to take some measures to de-risk climate. For example, if we continue to grow our population at the current rate, no matter how much financial support we get, we will keep negating the effect of the impact that we are hoping to aspire. For example, just as an example, that in 1981, Pakistan's population was 84 million, and we were producing 12 million tons of wheat. Today, we are producing 28 million tons, but that 36% has been negated because the population has jumped up by 186%. So if we do the same with finance, no matter what we bring in, if we keep increasing our population, we will not be able to cope with this challenge. The second thing is gender empowerment. We don't need that much money to improve the gender dynamics in the country, to give women equal access and opportunity. And if we keep half our population under-optimized, underutilized, not contributing or represented in the society, then we will also not be able to cope with the financial gaps it doesn't stand alone. We need to think how can we improve the overall geo-economic approach of the country within the region in our relationship outside with other countries. We cannot rely entirely and only on the GCF as the means to access finance. And these are some of the things I think we need to also look at. Along with investment, I think my recommendation would be in this report to add the inclusion of civil society and media and other stakeholders for creating that critical lobby that you need to put pressure. Because I see that, a lot of the points that are raised in this report are about the shortfall of the government. But we know that the government has functioned this way, will continue to function this way unless there is some external pressure from the citizens themselves to bring about the change that they want in their own lives. So we need to focus on creating that critical mass to put pressure on the government to bring the kind of reforms that you have recommended in your policy document. Thank you.
Asian Development Bank. Maybe I'll turn over to you if you could talk to us through your initial reflections.
Thank you, Kashyap. I think I'll start with what Tabea said, the lack of enabling environment. I think that is key to finance, climate, or anything basically. And that, of course, is the biggest gap. Coming back to the report, I think I like that point about, I think when I entered the road, I was talking to Kashyap about this. There were a lot of bits and pieces that we talked in corridors about the gaps in the governance. But it's good to see them in the consolidated in a report. And within that, there was a recommendation about consolidating or aligning different mechanisms and strategies or processes that exist within that governance frameworks or structure. For example, planning department would have their own processes. Climate change department would have some other screening processes, and then there are other departments as well, for example, finance. And on their own, they are good pieces of work, they are good instruments or tools to use, but they can also be counterproductive, or they can also be seen as more hoops to jump through, and that can be counterproductive. So I think that's streamlining those will in my view, be positive as recommended in the report. The last thing I want to come back to is how do we, what is our compass when we talk about climate finance or climate action? Is the NDC or let's say National Adaptation Plan? We don't have an LTS yet, long-term strategy for mitigation, but when that comes in, that will be another one. Now, these are done at the federal level and for the right reasons, but we don't see the buy-in from the provinces or other departments within the federal government. Why is that? And how can we, when we are, so we need to look at the process, how we develop these tools or documents. We start from it's a top-down approach essentially. We do some level of consultation, but largely it's a top-down approach. Can we flip that? Can we start from provinces or departments? Because they are the ones who are going to do the action on the ground. Yes, there is a lack of capacity, but that can be worked on. So in my view, we need to start from there at the provinces. And within those provinces, you need to go to individual department because climate change department is not going to implement the actions. It's the WAPTAs, it's the PHEs, it's the education, it's the health. Those are the ones that you can integrate those climate action into their portfolios or investments. So those need to be, in my view, we need to start from there and flip this process and make it a bottom-up approach. And I think And if I give an example of ADB, I think, and perhaps all ADBs maybe, so we try to integrate every project, regardless of its education, health, or agriculture. There is a process that it needs, because when you talk about climate finance, it doesn't have to be a GCF funding or it's just a disaster. Every department, projects in every sector can have a climate finance component in that. And within ADB, for example, we try to do that by capturing and try to integrate adaptation or mitigation measures within investment projects, regardless of the sector. Yes, in some cases it can be high, in other cases it's low, but every sector is contributing to climate change agenda. Thank you.
Thank you for having me here, first of all. My colleagues here in the presentation you just saw, I think, touched on some very interesting points. And some of the points which I wanted to discuss also have been touched upon. But I'll take lead from my colleague here on the right. First of all, from a GCF perspective, I think just to share this also, there are two accredited entities in Pakistan, which is NRSP and NGS Bank. And there are other multilaterals which are also GCF accredited entities. But what I would like to add over here is that I think there is a lot of opportunity to collaborate. I think there is in the climate finance space. There is a lot of which we are specifically looking at GCF or any other climate finance project. That opportunity remains open. I feel, and I've talked to people, and I think there is a lot of resources which have been allocated in terms of reaching milestones, institutional milestones, individual milestones, and those are all legit aspirations. But rather than spending so much time in terms of accreditation, which is a long process, there is a lot of opportunity to look at projects and collaborate, because if it is going to be a GCF project, it has to go through an accredited entity. Secondly, from an incentive point of view, which is a very valid point, I would like to share some examples and further take this point, is that the market also pivots, and also there is an opportunity at a more macro level which creates that space for climate finance to take place. While we look at the private sector, I think one of the most important elements is that the private sector wants to look at if there is any financial impact on it also, which is a very acceptable criteria in my opinion, because it has to have sustainability in terms of taking it forward, scaling it up, and it has to show some kind of viability, regardless, may it be driven by clients, may it be driven by policy. But we have seen in the last 10, 15 years that those incentives when provided to the private sector, they wasn't opted. And given my background in investment banking, and I saw the first generation of wind power projects which were financed locally and also in collaboration with multilaterals. So I think the financial incentive which they had, there was subsequently there was a second generation 14 and then subsequently 17. But in between there was also the solarization of at a country level, the solarization, which was also driven quite a bit by the state bank's incentive financing scheme. Interestingly enough, we today have 10 million. I think my colleague here had mentioned 10 million solarization, but that scheme of financing was available for 3 years before people actively started reaching out for it. And the reason, two things happened. Solar prices came down, and tariffs went up. So the markets kind of converged. The 2 pain points kind of converged, and there was a substantial offtake of solarization in this country at a SME level and at an individual level. Similarly, I think at the project finance level, there's an opportunity from a GCF perspective to collaborate with the accredited entities. But there is also another very good example which we've seen, which happened in the infrastructure space, where there was a PPP projects, public-private partnerships, which took place. Again, rightfully said, on the governance level, on the policy level, and Raisha also had mentioned, we know how it will operate, but it will also it will have subsequent generations of policy and frameworks which will get updated and which do change, and you will get it right. At the government of Sindh level, PP projects, the first projects, road projects which came up, is a great example also, because the government also offered a lot in terms of incentivizing private sector to come in and develop projects. So I believe and eventually when the confidence and the understanding, the capacity developed, the government also kind of weaned off what incentives they were providing in terms of infrastructure projects, because we understood how it worked. The private sector understood how it worked, and that's a similar case which has happened at the energy level, at the renewable energy space. One more thing I would like to share is, and the last one I would like to share is capacity building. So I think, and also the fact that I think sometimes there's too much confusion in terms of mitigation and adaptation projects. There should be clarity, but it requires patience. But we should focus on, rather than hitting those high numbers in terms of $500 million or $1 billion coming in to one go, or trying to go after that project. I think there is a lot of work which needs to be done at a modular level, which is going to benefit from a climate finance perspective and really help escalate, create capacity, and also creating projects. I think that clarity and that patience to work through it is also a very essential ingredient in terms of taking it forward. Once you do projects, you will also have a much better capacity in terms of contributing towards policy framework and asking for what the private sector's main points are in terms of addressing it through at the government level or at the policy level.
Thank you, Shadad. I think for the second round of questions, I'll start from where Mr. Isjam Ali left. So we discussed about one of the findings of the report is the lack of coordination or the need for better coordination. And I think the answer really is, can we start from the provinces? Because essentially the climate change is a local issue and the solution relies at the local level. So maybe Waqar Sahab, if I can come to you, what role do you think, within the provincial legislations that we have, do you see any role that the provinces can take in terms of leading on, because we know that the Sindh government is implementing a number of projects on that, and from coordination point of view, the environmental coordination point of view, what do you think in terms of recommendations, what role can the provinces take on this?
Thank you. Actually, provinces are doing a lot, as one of our presenter already has shown his presentation, that several government departments are working inside of the province or even a federal. Unfortunately, we are trying our level best every province, but one province is not aware about the activities of the other province. As still, I think some other provinces may not be knowing that how much projects related to climate finance have been initiated in Government of Sindh. I am not aware about the Balochistan. I am not aware about the Punjab. But no doubt the federal Ministry of Climate Change and Environmental Coordination, which is renamed as Environmental Coordination. So they have to play their role. They have to develop such a mechanism which can create a good coordination between all the provinces. They should play a centralized role, and those provinces, almost all the provinces needs capacity building and institutional strengthening. They should treat provinces like a mother organization, and they should support, whether it's a Sindh or Balochistan or AP or Punjab or even HK and GB. whatever we are doing, if I talk about the just finance, access to the finance, there are two entities as one are represented by JS Bank and another is NRS. Equivalent fund? No. No, there are two. There are two. In fact, in order to access those funds, I think we should not depend on only two. We need to accredit more. If not, then government should come forward. PND should initiate for as an accredited entity. DOCC, Directorate of Climate Change, Government of Sindh, has initiated this action, and that has been even pointed out in the ministry's one of the meeting. The Ministry of Climate Change and Environment Coordination has directed Government of Sindh, Directorate of Climate Change, please put it again on the behalf of department, not on behalf of the directorate. So we will again put it up as for the accredited entity, but there should be some other organizations in all the provinces, as this subject is cross-cutting. In Government of Sindh, we have, as I mentioned, that there are certain projects related to adaptation and mitigation which are already been taken and will be taken in future as well. So those departments where there are a lot of initiatives related to adaptation or even mitigation, like energy, like transport, like forest, like agriculture, they should also come forward to accredit themselves in order to access the funds. And this can be done with the support of MOCs, with the support of federal ministry. And they have, because they are supposed to coordinate with the provinces as well. It's my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Vikas Saab.
You actually don't need so many accredited entities. The process of accreditation is a fairly long one. The productive or the more collaborative part of it is that you can focus on putting up projects. It will not stop you from reaching out to JCI if you go to the accredited entity. It's my buy-in in terms of an accredited entity is there to put up the project for you. It does not stop you if you have an agri-based project or a livestock project or a water-based project or a coastal project. That project will go through. You can take any entity in terms of accredited NRSP or UADP or Acumen that you're going to reach out to them. The journey is fairly long and the cost implications around it are there also.
Already asked the provinces to get themselves accredited. About 8-10 months back.
That's fine, but I'm just saying that doesn't, and I think you can ask the
Yes,
ACM.
I don't have that experience of how to get the entity accredited. It must be somehow process as you are pointing out.
Okay. Do we have GCF online? Yes. So maybe I'll. Edward, can you hear me? Yes, I heard it. Great, wonderful. Apologies for the technical disruption. I think we got used to it during COVID, but it's still figuring out a lot of. But I'll come back to you where you left. I mean, so one of the findings of the report is though Pakistan remains among the top 10 vulnerable countries when it comes to climate change, but it does not feature among the top 10 recipients of climate finance. And we know that GCF has a global role when it comes to access to climate finance. I wanted to ask you what are the integrity and transparency frameworks or measures that the GCF has proposed to the countries in terms of ensuring that the climate finance is free from corruption, it is utilized transparently and effectively. If you can talk to us through some of those recommendations.
Absolutely, sure. If I may just reflect on a very quick point here, I think that the aftermath of the unfortunate disaster in Pakistan demand and effectiveness in climate governance and decision making in government. Now, this not only holds true with the actions in Pakistan or the stakeholders in Pakistan, this has also been demonstrated across the board, and in fact within the GCF itself. What the GCF is doing now is reevaluating the mechanisms that it has in terms of how we are making access to finance a little bit more effective, more efficient. We're looking at improving our accreditation and reaccreditation process, and we at the IIU, the Independent Integrity Unit, are also looking and evaluating how it is that we can provide and add value to what our stakeholders find important. And to that end, I had initially started talking a little bit about some of the implementations that we have internally, which was, of course, enhancing our fiduciary standards and ensuring that the project approval process is a little bit more effective and efficient. We're also strengthening our project monitoring and reporting capabilities and ensuring that the accredited entities and our stakeholders have sufficient enough integrity and anti-corruption policies, and that those policies are being effected adequately to ensure that climate financing is being executed as best as it can. Now, we also recognize that there are competing priorities within countries. The climate disaster, the climate emergency is one, but we also have other things that really do need to be considered. And we have kind of touched on it. The report indicates that in the aftermath of the 2022 floods, there was a notable lack of action in terms of access to financing. But we also want to be cognizant that, indeed, the floods did happen in 2022. However, the process of coming to, say, for example, the GCF or other funds to get climate financing, that is an onerous task, right? So in terms of a measure, that may not necessarily be a very good indicator on efficiency because there's quite a lot that goes into putting together a program for climate financing. And I know that there are engagements with the countries on how to address this, and we at the GCF are trying to be as responsive as possible. And that has become a mission for our new executive director, Mafalda, to be able to ensure that this transpires. With the IIU in terms of integrity and specifically on climate projects, what we look to do is work on improving our engagements, right? Increasing capacity building opportunities, creating awareness raising programs and initiatives, as well as engaging with civil society organizations, including other stakeholders, to try and promote country ownership and ensure that there's better awareness about the projects. In some of the work that we have done, we have found that stakeholders are not necessarily aware that a GCF project is being implemented somewhere. So that demonstrates that there is very limited awareness being created by the country, and then also not being addressed by the GCF. So we need to ensure that we're allowing that to transpire. Some of the challenges that the GCF has is that when we enter into contractual obligations with our countries, with our stakeholders in project implementation, the downstream actions for integrity violations is tasked to our implementing partners, right? To our accredited entities. So they need to be able to ensure that they have the capacity and wherewithal to conduct a response to an integrity violation, make sure that they comply with GCF standards and the contractual obligations. Now, we all have different maturity levels. All organizations have different maturity levels in terms of the ability to respond to these issues. And what we're doing now is trying to work and assess on what level the different countries and accredited entities, national designated authorities, all our NDAs, all our stakeholders are, and how do they affect the mechanisms that are important to ensure that these obligations are met. So the GCF is being quite active in this regard, ensuring that we do have compliance. We're looking to ensure that we do build some integrity into the process. And in fact, we are also reevaluating our accreditation master agreements to ensure that it aligns more broadly with the mission of the GCF, as well as ensure that we do reach a certain critical mass. Now, in terms of engagements with our stakeholders, one of the things that I touched on was to ensure that we have the ability to inform accordingly, provided the capacity and skill set. But one of the things that's important is to ensure that the Caribbean entities know and our stakeholders know that they're not alone in terms of addressing utility issues. The IIU and the GCF is always available, and through the mechanisms available to us, can report violations of our prohibited practices policies within the UN system. It's called sanctionable practices, and that's issues related to fraud, corruption, collusion, and the ecosystems around that. So that mechanism is available to stakeholders, but stakeholders are not quite aware of that. So the report does touch in many of these aspects. We do recognize there's quite a bit of growth that needs to happen, and I think that a collaborative effort will get us there. Just to make sure that we need to get there in a little bit more a reasonable time frame and ensure that our projects are a little bit more clearly executed from design all the way through to implementation. So with that, I will give it a bit of a break, but give anybody an opportunity to ask any questions, and I'll hopefully be able to provide some sort of responses. Thank you.
Thank you, Albert. I think we already have one question for you, but we'll come back at the end in almost 10 minutes. Tavius, if I can come to you, I think you already alluded to the cross-cutting nature of governance and the public financial management system. And if I can ask you a more specific question, that from your experience, what specific reforms at a macro level and within, I think, the fiscal reforms do you think are important in the context of Pakistan to enable us to, again, I think, because we're talking this in context of climate finance. So what specific reforms would you recommend?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a very useful question. I mean, I think, again, it comes back to just as you say, my initial point that we need to look at climate finance in terms of a broader ecosystem of financing for development. Look, Pakistan at the moment raises about 10% of GDP and tax revenues per year. Our interest payments this year are about 8% of GDP. Historically, Pakistan has been spending less than 1% of GDP on development at the federal level per year. Less than 1% of GDP, maybe 2% if you include the provincial level. So, we can have these very specific discussions about what needs to happen for the PC1s for climate projects and all the rest of it. We can get into the real nitty-gritty and the details. But zooming out a little bit, if your government is spending only 1% of GDP on development overall every year, what chance do you have of meeting your adaptation and mitigation? So what do you need to do to fix that? I think there's two sides to this. Firstly, we need to fix the revenue system. There's no reason that Pakistan should be stuck at 10% of GDP in terms of the revenue that it raises. It's an outlier among developing countries. It's very clear what needs to happen. We need to move towards a more progressive taxation system, a broader base of taxation. We need to start taxing sources of income that are currently barely taxed at all, which includes real estate, property taxation, agricultural taxation, retail taxation. I think a huge amount's been written about this. A huge amount is known about how to do it. What really is required now is the political will to make that happen. If you start to get your revenues up to 15% of GDP, start to pay down the debt, start to reduce your interest costs, all of a sudden you've got fiscal space to start really making a dent in your climate adaptation and mitigation. Right? But without that, I hate to say it, right? But we're really fiddling around at the margin. We're really just playing at the margin unless we get some of these fundamental issues resolved. On the expenditure side, I mean, again, as I say, I think some of the recommendations here in terms of tagging projects, in terms of a PC1 process that is very transparent in terms of how resources are being used. Again, very, very useful. But I think we need to look overall as well at the public expenditure system, the development planning system. We need to make sure the projects are being executed. Every year we have very low execution rates on the development budget. We have these continued problems of coordination, I'm going to say it again, between the federal and the provincial government, with this real lack of clarity on what the provincial government is spending on, what the provincial government versus federal government is spending on. We have parallel overlapping development programs. We have vertical funds that overlap with provincial mandates. It's, this is some of the really fundamental stuff that needs to be resolved. And I think having just a basic public expenditure management system and a public investment management system has to be the first step. And we can do all of the sophisticated design we like on the climate side, but unless we fix the underlying problems of the basic system, there's only so much we're going to get out of that. And the same as I've said on the revenue side. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Tobias. Aisha, I'll come to you. I think, again, in your initial reflections, you focus more on the inclusion side as well, the need for the representation of the underserved or marginalized communities. And I think we discussed this in the morning as well as part of the report, that a lot of inclusive platforms in the legislation are missing. What, from your experience, how do you think can the climate decision making and policy making be made more inclusive? And I think especially focusing on the civil society participation, because we see when there's a COP, the CSOs become very active, but how do we ensure the citizens and the CSOs participation?
Thank you, Kashan. I think, to begin with, when we make policies in Pakistan, it's becoming increasingly apparent that we make them as a statement of intent, but with no intention of implementing them. That is why they look very good on paper, but when it comes to actually taking them to the ground, to the people and implementing, there is no ownership. Because the policies were never made in consultation or co-crafted with the ideas or the views of the people who are going to have to live with those policies. Other than the Civil Society Coalition, for which I work as an advocacy platform, I work at the ground group level with communities, specifically with mountain communities. So I have a first-hand interaction in delivering, conceiving, and implementing projects for them. So the one thing that becomes very obvious when you work at the ground group with boots on ground is that working with the community and building their hopes and aspirations into the document that you're preparing is critical for ownership and sustainability. That is what doesn't happen in Pakistan. These are top-down policies. They're developed at the policy level. And if there is consultation because it's a donor requirement, it is just a tokenism. There's a very hurried round of consultation done with other stakeholders just to check that box to say, yes, we have gone through the process. But it's not really the thorough intake that you get and then have the intention to include that as part of your document. So that is lacking. In 2016, Pakistan became a member of the Open Government Partnership, which I thought was a very robust step towards incremental progress in every endeavor that we make, because what that meant was transparency, accountability, and co-creating policies. So we would take baby steps and we would at least fulfill some targets that we've set for ourselves within 2 years and then graduate to the next set of targets. Because if you look at policy at the national or subnational level, you'll see that the documents are always highly ambitious. They do not start with the small ambitious steps, and they don't have a price tag to it, they don't have a time frame attached to it. So there's no monitoring mechanism that is apparent in the policy itself. So no one can actually go back and check on you to say this was supposed to be done in this time frame and why has it not been done. So I think that consultation with the communities is critical, and taking policy to local governance and developing the risk frameworks also through the local government, taking into account the vulnerability of the community and the solutions that they have to offer. Now, communities may not be very technologically or scientifically aware of
Thank you, Aisha. Next, I think I'll come to Hez Jamali and picking up again from the ambitiousness. If you look at the NDC targets, and I think those are very ambitious as well. So the NDC targets refer to 50% reductions in the carbon emissions, and around 15% of it is based on the domestic resources, and 35% of it is contingent upon the access to international finance. And given the, I think, ADB's focus on decarbonization, and I think you referred to it in your initial thoughts as well, what specific strategies do you think the sectoral mitigation and adaptation do we need in terms of meet these targets, both from the finance point of view and also from meeting the targets as well?
So I'm not an economist, so I can't talk a lot about that, but I would like to talk about the technical side of the decarbonization. And I think when we look at the national greenhouse gas inventory of Pakistan, so two sectors that stand out: 45% energy, and almost similar 45% agriculture. So I guess for energy the equation is technically relatively simple. We need to move from fossil fuels to renewables, and major constraint, if I understand it, is capital. So decarbonization is expensive, and this is why we are having these fights in those all COP meetings. No one wants to commit to it. Even the most developed, wealthy countries, they don't want to commit to it because it disrupts the economy, or that is the perception. So for a country like Pakistan, I think it's not easy. I would just, in the interest of time, I'll just focus on maybe agriculture. It's one of the key things that missing is baselines. So if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Livestock contributes 22% of our emissions. And the last census, livestock census we did was, I think, in 2006, if I'm correct. So for the last 18, 20 years, we haven't counted our animals. So that means our baseline, we don't know. It would have a large uncertainties in that number. So we don't even know where our starting point is. So that is, I think we need to invest in R&D to get those numbers right. Second, I think some of the work that ADB is involved and that I'm really interested in is the rice industry. It's a major industry. It uses most of our fresh water. But when you go to a farmer and say, there's a lot of methane coming out of your rice field and it uses a lot of water, we should do something about it. It's a problem. And they look at you, they say, yes, it's a problem, but it's not my problem. So how do we make that farmer's problem? And I think we need to bring in incentives. I think carbon markets, obviously, we talk a lot about it, and some of it is now a keyword in Islamabad. And yes, we do. There is a seminar every second day happening about, but apart from sin, we haven't done any action on it. So what's missing there? What's stopping us? So we are exploring that. Of course, the first thing that we came across, there was no data. There is not a single paper published on emissions from agriculture in Pakistan. So why we have some of the top-notch universities, why are we not doing it? So we started engaging with those and trying to sort of understand where this, and I personally have a background in emission measurements, so I think we are launching first field study on measuring greenhouse gas emissions from rice fields and hopefully from wheat as well in the coming season. And I think one of the, and we are not looking at it as more an environmental issue. I think we are looking at it as an economic opportunity because rice is one of our major exports. And Europe is one of our major markets, particularly for our high-value basmati rice. And there is an increasing demand for low-carbon rice. There is there is a lot of legislation that's coming into play where they are putting carbon taxes, which means the importers sitting in Europe, they prefer importing rice with a low carbon footprint because they save their money. So it's not an environmental decision, it's an economic decision or financial decision for them. So similarly, I think you might have heard, Europe has announced that from the 1st of January next year, any meat they import, they would have to demonstrate that it's free from deforestation. It hasn't, any deforestation hasn't occurred. So I think these are very clear signals for us that we need, when we talk about mitigation, we need to see it as an economic opportunity because that's the only way we can afford it. We can't do it mitigation for the sake of mitigation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll just come to our last panelist, Shehzad. So Shehzad, as in one of the accredited entity, so JS Bank has been leading on climate projects. But we also, I think, discussed in the morning, and at the panel this was pointed out, that the private sector footprint is very, very small. And I think you referred to in your question in the morning that one of the reasons is the understanding, the knowledge, and the capacity building. So my question is, from your experience, what sort of enabling environment do we need to attract this private sector investments, both in mitigation and adaptation projects? Is it merely an incentive problem, or what problem is it?
So personally, I feel the private sector is capital allocation is more efficient. And I think I tried to answer that in my previous comment also, is that if there is the appropriate incentive provided, or there is an outcome which benefits. Let's not deny the fact that the private sector also has a certain threshold in terms of an obligation in terms of returns. Making money is not, I don't think it's the same, but it's their obligation as far as they have. In terms of supporting the larger economy, also and the profitability of their activity. So and the availability of capital is also limited. So they will try and efficiently allocate the capital wherever they have better returns or meets their respective objectives. That's one. Number two is creating access to capital. I think when we talk about policy framework, I think very valid points raised by everybody. We have to make sure that when we create, first of all, we need to zoom into what the pain points are in terms of undertaking climate finance projects. Lately, I've started, I think we need to stop focusing on the mitigation adaptation. We just need to see holistically what has a climate impact, and we should look at those projects very actively. But while we create access to capital and addressing some very major pain points private sector has in terms of climate finance projects, we should also be focusing on de-risking those projects. There is an option where the public sector would have a lot of opportunity to be the enabler to de-risk those projects. One great example, and I would like, it's been spoken about a lot of times, is the State Bank's renewable energy financing scheme which came in. So it was out in 2014-15, if I recall correctly, and massive offtake was not happening till for at least 2 years. That was a fixed pricing financing opportunity available for solarization specifically in multiple categories. So I think that has to be addressed. Number two, I feel while we de-risking, we look at create access to capital, we should, one of our panelists, I think, mentioned fiscal space. We need to have that, I think the gentleman word, we need to have that fiscal space or the avenue or the conduit to undertake climate finance projects. So if we look at some of our major export generating entities, textiles, agriculture, rice, whatever initiatives they need to take, they need to have some access to capital in terms of foreign exchange. Those should be also addressed how we're going to do it. In the morning, while we had the presentation, there was references to debt raising and how do we raise debt to the domestic market, to the international market. I think one of the areas is that if we are able to successfully de-risk capital or projects, that will create the avenue and let the private sector flourish in terms of contributing towards climate finance. I think that we've seen clear evidence of that happening. We saw
much. I think as we are already a bit late on our time schedule, so we'll just take 2 questions. If you have the question, please introduce yourself, refer to the panelist who you want to ask the question, and there'll be mics around. Yes, sir. And I think you will have to speak a bit louder so that the online.
My question is for Albert. Hi Albert, thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Ali. I'm working as a consultant with ADB based at Economic Affairs Division. My question is that now working with the government, I'm seeing certain aspects of applying to GCF. So accreditation is the #1 issue. And as one of the panelists has also said that. The other thing is the process. I was in WWF and it took, the Recharge project took something like 6 to 7 to 8 years to get it approved from GCF. So I have 2 quick questions. Once you have national designated authorities, can't they act as your accredited face for all the government departments? Is that not possible? The other thing is the time which you guys take in processing an application. So yeah, these are my quick questions.
Thank you. Would you like a response now, or do you want to go to another question before I jump in?
If there is any other question to GCF, we can.
Hello, I wanted to add to the same question. So I'm Anam Rathore and I work as Advisor Climate Finance at GIZ. And we're supporting a lot of government entities in their GCF accreditation project proposal development. And I think I'm going to add on to that question that the GCF processes take a lot of time. If you look at Pakistan, a country which is facing, disasters, climate disasters, multiple climate disasters every year. So if a project, we talk about adaptation now because I think that's Pakistan's primary need right now. So an adaptation project takes like 5 years. If you start from this, developing the concept note, getting the funding and everything, it takes at least 5 years, and the climatic conditions are changing so rapidly. So I think my question is sort of how can we accelerate this process? What we're suffering right now, what Pakistan is facing right now, we don't have 5 years or 4 years. For us, climate action, especially adaptation and resilience, it's something that should happen right now.
Thank you very much for both questions. From a GCF perspective, I think it is very, very well noted that the accreditation process does take quite a bit of time, and also through to the project approval process through to the board approval. What I would like to kind of preface my response here is that we are with the Independent Integrity Unit responsible for integrity-related matters. So my guidance to you would be, if you wouldn't mind sending me an email, I can maybe make my email available on this chat, or Kashif can forward that to you, and then we can get the relevant parties involved. The reason I say that is because I do not want to misspeak, and also because the GCF is currently going through a process to try and improve and make this better. And I do know that there's been a response from the international community to do that across the board with other climate finance institutions. So the modalities to make this quicker are there. I think over the past years we've seen quite an improved time period. I think it does. We did have it at about 7 or 8 years previously, and roughly, if I want to recall now, and don't hold me to this, I believe it's about 2 years now. But they are also trying and make this a little bit better. But I would like to put you in touch with the parties that are responsible and are actually working on this, and they will give
you, Albert. If there is any last question, we can take one more question.
So just before I hand over, so Kashif, if you don't mind, maybe the participants can get my contact info from you, and then we can touch base from there.
Sure, I'll circulate your email address if that's.
Absolutely, thank you very much.
Thank you. So, so I think we don't have more questions, but thank you very much to all the panelists and for your interventions. And I think this has been quite a candid and an open discussion, as sort of a conversation, which was also an objective of ours. That how can we start this conversation around the improvements in climate governance and the climate financing frameworks. And I hope that together we will continue to advocate on these findings, because as Madam Aisha also pointed out in the morning, that the civil society has an important role in pushing to the government. So thank you very much. On that note, I think we'll move towards closing, and I'll request Advocate Ashfaq Habib Saab, who is our but sorry, before we go there, I'll request Masood Khan Sahib, who's a Special Secretary, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa Climate Change Ministry. Sir, if you can finance and accountability, speak on more, I think, broader context of governance and finance in the country. And the discussion that we had, I think, the presentation of the Q&A that sets the scene. What I'm going